Why, hello everyone, and welcome to the final reading of Shadowbound. We are going to be reading chapters 23 through 25 and the epilogue. Of course, give everyone a little bit of extra time to come and settle down, get snacks, get cozy. Also, be sure to give Echo one big thank you for all the art she's drawn. Sorry, I don't have much to say. I'm excited to be reading these last couple of chapters, but I also don't want to say anything, you know? Well, I guess what I can say is if you've been enjoying these readings and are interested in buying a copy of the book for yourself to support the channel and my authoring journey, there is a link in the description below or in the pinned chat message. And as one last reminder, although I might also say this reminder again at the Q&A portion, all these readings, they will be free up until the sequel to Shadowbound is published, at which point everything past Chapter 7 will be available to paying channel members. It's only $3 a month. So you won't need to worry about that right now. But if you're watching this in the future, thank you for your contribution. And when the sequel does come out, I'm going to be doing a reading of that too. Not right away, but that will happen, and I will schedule that. And you will hear about that when it happens. And hopefully we'll have a bunch more people tune in live. Just to see how things have grown from now. But of course, until then, I hope you all enjoy the epic finale of Shadowbound, which will start in a minute and a half. The reading today is expected to take about an hour and a half, I believe. Roughly. And of course, with it being the end of the book, I'll be able to talk about a lot more for the Q&A. So please, save your final thoughts, questions, comments, theories for the next book until the end. All right, let's get into the reading. Chapter 23. The space is large, very large. Ethan remembers Shadow telling tales that it had been told, of grandiose celebrations that would take place in this very throne room, full of beings of all backgrounds and races. How they'd mingle with one another without caring for who or what they were, allowed to simply be themselves and enjoy some complimentary food and drink from dusk to dawn. Of course, he never witnessed any of those moments himself, nor did Shadow. They all passed long before Shadow ever met Riona. And now the throne room sits empty and lifeless, with tall marble pillars tinged a purple blue, crumbling from age, and the flameless hanging braziers above them swing in the castle's cold draught. It's a dim and foreboding room, one where many decrees have been given that he had once carried out personally. Riona existed almost exclusively in this quiet hall, only retiring to her chambers when she felt truly exhausted. The door sails through the air and is only stopped by a second blast of black flame, which reduces the wood and metal to cinder and scrap. The twisted metal binds clatter to the floor and skids to a halt at the foot of the raised dais that held up the throne of Riona. Some of the stones that make up the flooring of the room are cracked and partially uneven, clearly having been upheaved and replaced in the not-so-distant past. He can't help but take note of the three shadows that stand at the foot of the dais as well. Jake on the right, Kimberly on the left, their stares empty and lifeless. Shadow stands at the front and center, sword out at the ready by its side. Its cold gaze lands on Ethan, violet eyes pulsing from its helmet. Then he looks up at the throne itself, and almost does a double take. He wasn't prepared for who his eyes lay upon. Riona, of course, sits atop as a queen would, a long black staff in her hand. The staff is adorned with a large glowing amethyst, from which emanates two long spectral chains that hang in the air quietly, fading away the farther the links are from the gemstone. One is partially shattered, the links floating freeform in some sort of jagged line. That is Ethan's chain. The other chain, Shadow's, shines brightly, with the links twisting through one another, interlocking in a way to show that they are determined to never break. It winds down the shaft of the staff, with the other freeform chain hovering high in the air above the amethyst, almost like the shattered links are trying to float away and escape. But Riona herself looks drastically different from the being he fondly remembers. Her black hair, once dark as night and light as a feather, hangs heavy over her shoulders and down her back with a greasy sheen to it. Her long black dress is faded, wrinkled and torn, and the purple fabric that hangs from her dull copper belt is horribly stained. Her sharp-edged collar is bent when it's supposed to stand straight, and the padded shoulders the collar is attached to seem to be trying to fall off her bony shoulders. The sight of her only makes Ethan even more angry, as the dress she wears is one that he bought for her with his own coins centuries ago, and he took good care of it for her, too. Her glossy black heels seem to be the only thing that has been left in an ageless condition, minus a small spot of white dust on the right toe, and they've certainly lost most of their shine. Her emerald eyes have sunken into her skull, and her body is much thinner from when he left. She used to perpetually look the young age of 37. Now it's almost as if she's aged 3 centuries within the last 3 years he's been away. Riona? He can't help but breathe in shock and awe. A part of him doesn't want to believe that this is Riona, but he knows that the wizard on a throne can only be her.
Hello, Ethan.
she says, spitting as she says his name aloud. Even her voice sounds scratchy and dry, a far cry from her eloquent shouts and sweet-sounding compliments. So nice of you to finally show up. Do you know how long I've been waiting for you to return? Riona, he takes a step forward, brow furrowed. He can't help but display his mild concern for her well-being. What happened to you? None of your concern, she snaps back, jerking forward in her seat. The cheap copper and jade crown atop her head slides forward with her sharp movement, threatening to fall off completely. Her eyes flash with something dangerous and unhinged, a look he's seen more than once before. He quickly sucks in a breath and holds it, trying to ready himself for whatever she says next. A smile creeps onto her face, her lips jerking upwards as she does so. You've probably come to beg to be at my side again, haven't you? She sits back on the throne, appearing pleased with herself. Well, I'm done listening to you, Ethan. I've grown tired of your constant whining, though I must thank you for bringing the Prince of Mirage right to my throne, but it's no way to win me over. She lets out a cackle, sharp and shrill rather than smooth and rich. I have no further need of your services. Take the Shadow and Prince alive. Do what you will with the girl, but kill the husk. Ethan stands frozen in place, dumbfounded. Shadow's figure instantly goes rigid. Even Kimberly and Jake eye the fragment Shadow with unease, clearly feeling that something is amiss. Kill, its hollow voice echoes, eyes widening. Ethan. The chain that wraps around Riona's staff wavers ever so slightly. Something faint tingles in the back of Ethan's head, a presence he's not felt in quite some time. He can just barely feel Shadow's mind, slow with thought, yet alarmed all the same. A tinge of red begins to return to Shadow's gaze as it stares back at him. Recognition. He knows it's beginning to feel recognition. It's a storm of relief, horror, longing, and confusion, all that makes his gut churn with the same sense of wanting to reach out and embrace it. It recognizes Ethan standing on the other end of the throne room. Shadow? Ethan asks quietly, though his voice still carries across the room with ease. Enough of that, Riona hisses from above. With a slight tilt of her staff, Shadow freezes, its weaponless arm half raised in the air, outstretched. The little red glimmer in its eyes dies, swallowed by bright violet, and the presence of hope fades once more. What's the point in fighting? The intrusive question stabs at Ethan's thoughts once again. Shadow narrows its eyes and steps forward, raising its weapon with clear intention. A flurry of black ice and snow swirls around Kimberly's hands, and Jake hefts a blazing sword of ebony. Ready, Ethan speaks up, his hands reaching back to grip the edges of his cape. Lucre steps forward on his left, squaring up with Jake with his jade sword raised high. Amber appears on his left, staring at Kimberly with a nervous expression, holding her spear out in front of her at the ready regardless. Beneath Ethan's feet, he can feel the tremor of vines shifting under the foundation of the castle. Riona, once again, laughs. Oh, you pathetic husk. I don't want all of you destroying my throne room now. She slams the butt of her staff down on the ground, and in an instant the shadows jerk to life. The darkness casted from the pillars stretch and curve, rushing towards the four. Ethan grabs his cape instinctively, but he's not fast enough. The shadows rise and wrap around Amber and Lucre in an instant. Amber opens her mouth, but her head disappears before any sound can escape it. Just like that, the two are gone, leaving Ethan and Blaze behind. Wordlessly, Kimberly and Jake step into the nearest shadow themselves, off to carry out Riona's orders. What's the point in fighting, Ethan? Ethan grits his teeth, anger raging in his chest. He's so close to the end. He just have to keep going a little longer. They'll be fine, Blaze mutters to him, referring to Amber and Lucre. Ethan nods back, flames beginning to curl around his arms. Then let's finish our plan. The darkness subsides, and Amber's shriek dies in her throat as she lays eyes upon a bedroom. It reminds her of the study from the ruined palace on Mirage, with a door leading to a hallway on one side of the room and a balcony overlooking Corridon on the other. There's a bed on her left, rotting and unused, the faded fabric that once was sheets in tatters with age. On her right is a small desk, or what's left of it anyway. The wood is gnarled, the structure sideways as two of the legs have separated from the top, laying crushed underneath. It's dim as what little light manages to beam down through Riona's clouds streams in from the balcony doorway. And quiet. Spear clutched in fear-gripped fingers, she takes a step towards the closed door, determined to return to the throne room to help Ethan as best she can. And if she runs into Lucre along the way, even better. And then, before her very eyes, she watches the front door freeze over in an instant, black ice coating the aged wood. The darkness warps once more, rising to form Kimberly's twisted shadow, ice and snow swirling behind her at her beck and call. Amber's stomach sinks as her friend regards her with emotionless eyes. She now points her spear at a blessed cryomancer, a wizard she can't even begin to contend with. I wonder if I should spare you, Kimberly hums, tilting her head ever so slightly, or kill you. Amber's eyes begin to burn with tears. Kim, please, I don't want to do this. This is not your choice. The temperature of the room plummets as Kimberly raises her hand, and the ice and snow behind her rush forward to form a floating black-white spike hovering just over her shoulder. It releases, and Amber swipes at it. Using the spear, she forces the projectile into the ground, where the ice hisses as it comes into contact with the stone. When she turns her attention back to the shadow, more spikes are now hovering around Kimberly's head, ready to be fired. Maybe I will just freeze you instead, she says with an eerie grin. That is, if you keep up. Amber drops to her knees as the spikes release at once, swiping away those that she can that may still hit her. Swirling snow stings her cheeks as it swirls around the room, collecting for another barrage. Amber manages to scramble to her feet and bats away two more spikes, stumbling backwards as she struggles to find her footing against the speed and force of the spikes being thrown at her. Keeping the spikes away from her is all she can really do, putting all of her concentration and energy into simply staying alive. She doesn't have combat experience. She doesn't have magic she can use to fight back. She's just a healer with a spear. It doesn't take long for her to wind up standing on the balcony, sending the ice spikes out into the ether of the clouds above or the ground far, far below. Her heel hits one of the stone pillars that holds up the balcony railing. This is as far as she goes. The spikes only get faster and faster, and the cold isn't helping her reflexes. As she heaves between swipes, she can see the air turn to mist in front of her. Her lungs begin to burn from the biting frost that radiates from Kimberly's figure. Stop! Amber manages to cry. The barrage stops, to her surprise, but at the cost of Kimberly smiling back at her menacingly. You wish to plead for your life? Amber lets out a dry cough and tries to catch her breath in the biting cold. Kim, If I were to spare you, then you would concede and join our ranks, she interrupts, slowly stepping closer and closer to Amber, ice spreading out from under her feet as they land. Ice spikes float around her head at the ready, bobbing up and down with her graceful movements. And if I were to not, then the lady would have a new sculpture. Amber doesn't reply, collapsing to her hands and knees with exhaustion as the cold sets into her muscles at full force. Her saliva dries on her tongue, turning thick and sticky in her mouth. The cloud of her breath seems to crystallize into small ice particles, or it could simply be her vision swimming. Just then, a scream echoes through the hall beyond the ice-over door, ethereal yet raw all the same. It's pain, rage, and regret all rolled into one. Amber musters the energy to lift her head to see Kimberly paused in the balcony doorway, frowning towards the hall door. Jake? A gust of cold wind rolls over Lucre's arms and legs, but the darkness remains. His chest begins to constrict itself as he whirls around on the spot, trying to find any source of light he can seek solace in. To his left and right are walls, painted a cold blue that chills the air around him. He tightens his grip on his sword. He has his magic, but if he uses too much, he'll pass out for sure. And since that wizard on the throne wants his shadow, and Amber's nowhere nearby as far as he can tell, he can't afford to pass out. A small glow suddenly appears, but not a glow of comfort. It's distant as well, flickering against a dark stone wall. Black fire with faint white tips, engulfing a long blade that is held by the side of a leg. His eyes dart upwards in an instant, and lock on with the shadow's red irises. The shadow raises his hand, flames burning in his palm. A flare of panic ignites within Lucre. They're in a small hallway, and he has no escape. He can't see any nearby doors. The shadow is in front of him, and endless, tight darkness is behind him. The fire in the shadow's hand expands without warning, filling the hallway with its dark flames. Lucre releases his sword from his hand and lifts his arms up in front of him, sucking in a breath and gritting his teeth to concentrate, even as his heart pounds in his chest with fear. His sword dissolves into sand before it hits the stone floor, and the orange grains fill the hallway to meet the flames. The roar of the fire fills his ears as it blasts his stand wall, trying to reach him. He can feel its scorching heat on his front, turning his back icy cold. The blast ends after what feels like an eternity. Most of the sand that made his sword is now solid glass, leaving him with few grains left over, enough to make a single arrow. Converting the glass back into sand will take more effort than he currently has to spare. Through the glass, as the final black embers die out, he notices that the shadow is gone. His stomach drops as his feet spin him around, just to find the shadow looming over him, his sword in the air and ready to strike. Lucre twists out of the way, and the hot blade streaks past him and clangs against the stone floor. With a yell, he dives at the shadow with all his might, sending the two to the ground. Lucre reaches for the shadow's sword, determined to get his hands on a proper weapon again, as the shadow does his best to keep it from the Cerberus. A fist rises and hits the side of Lucre's face, knocking him aside. His back slams into the side of the hallway, head spinning. You, The shadow growls, pointing his sword at Lucre's head. Are too troublesome. Are too troublesome. Lucre doesn't reply, his mind racing as his senses slowly return. The shadow is standing over him again, glaring down with mild anger. His attention is on Lucre's head and arms, and so is his weapon. The shadow bends down and wraps his burning hand around Lucre's left arm. Stand up. Lucre wraps his tail around the shadow's nearest leg and pulls with all his might. Surprised, the shadow stumbles as his leg is pulled out from underneath him, and he falls on top of Lucre's body, his sword flying from his hand. It skids across the floor, the flames that surround it sputtering out, and plunging the hallway into complete darkness once more. Lucre thrashes against the shadow, his heat sense just barely lighting the cooling hilt as he fights to free himself. The shadow plants his knee on Lucre's back in response, lunging for the sword hilt as well. Lucre, with his hand outstretched, wills the little sand he has left at his command forward. The grains swarm the shadow's face, attacking his eyes ferociously. Gah! The shadow cries, trying to bat away the sand. He rolls off of Lucre's back and scoots around on the floor frantically in a pointless attempt to escape the small sand cloud. Lucre springs forward and finally obtains the shadow's sword, long and slender, its hilt cold to the touch. He lifts himself up from the floor with his tail, then stands fully on his legs, turning to face the fading red figure of the shadow. He strides up to the shadow's side and drives the sword into his chest without a second thought. The blade sinks through the shadow's body with ease, almost as if he were made of air. And yet the shadow roars in pain anyway, thrashing against the blade that now pins him to the floor. Lucre attempts to channel his light into the sword, but ends up making his fingers spark against the hilt instead. The harder he pushes, the harder the sword rejects his magic. It could be because the sword itself is made of shadow, something that doesn't mix well with light. While it's a good weapon for the time being, he can't use it as a conduit. He holds up a hand and summons the sand still at his disposal, creating a knife with a blade as long as his index finger. He bends down close to the shadow, places the tip of the knife next to the sword, and channels his magic once more. A large white flash fills his vision, and the shadow screams even louder, his voice devolving into a single note of noise. As the flash dies and his vision returns, he finds the shadow's entire left side of his body turned to mist. His mouth is open, face full of agony, and yet his shout is suddenly silent. Lucre stands, his body feeling tired from a lack of energy. How much more magic would he have to use to kill a twisted shadow outright? "Jake?" comes a distant call, muffled by the wall of glass. The other shadow isn't far. Maybe they're with Amber as well. Lucre steps up to the glass and places his free hand on its smooth surface. Even though he knows it's cold just from the blue hue he sees it as in the dark. The chill he feels is almost similar to the ice that Ethan made back on Mirage. Slowly, the glass begins to crumble away into sand, starting from where his hand touches its surface. As the hole widens, icy air begins to blast at his arm and chest. The cold combined with his drained magic makes his eyes begin to droop. Training for battle is one thing, but using everything he has at his disposal in a proper fight is another. He didn't think he'd use his magic so much, nor wind up in an environment that he has to constantly fight off the urge to sleep. He doesn't have a torch to keep himself warm, like the guards do back on Mirage. He doesn't have amber to keep his magic replenished. His willpower won't last him much longer if he remains in this low-energy state. The glass completely disappears, replaced by a shifting mass of mirage sand. He walks through the mass, willing it to reform into his trusty jade sword as he makes his way down the cold hallway. The blue wall of stone he follows slowly fades into white the farther he wanders, passing iced-over doors on his way. "Jake!" the shadow calls again, sounding much closer this time. A strong blast of cold air batters his face, sending chills down his back. "Do not tell me you need help with that little pest." Luke rebares his fangs, readjusting his grip on his sword's hilt. He wants to at least take a swipe at this other shadow before his energy depletes. Small, wet pricks begin to batter his face, landing on his cheeks and nose. The smell of the air turns crisp, almost sweet in a weird way. He doesn't know if he's still getting closer to the shadow, or if it had returned to whatever it had been doing to Amber before the interruption. Luke recreates a small, brief burst of light to illuminate the hallway before him. The glow of his magic strikes against something black and glossy that sticks to the wall to his right. Ahead of him is an iced-over doorway, and standing in front of said doorway is the second shadow. The shadow turns her head to stare in the direction of his light, and upon laying her eyes on Lucre, her face contorts into surprise. Cones of black ice hang in the air around her, their sharp points protruding from some sort of glittering gray cushion. Lucre grits his teeth and charges at the shadow with all the energy he can muster. The movement shakes the shadow out of her spell, and with fury in her eyes she extends an arm at him, an ethereal shriek leaving her lips. With his arms weighed down with ever-growing exhaustion, he grips his sword with both hands and swings at the flying ice, using the flat of the blade to bat them away from him. He plants his right foot down in front of him and begins to spin to the left. He slashes downward at the shadow's extended arm, the blade passing through her like cutting through air. From her hand up to her elbow, her form bursts into black mist. With the momentum of the slash, Lucre swings his left leg around, bringing the blade up to chest height, and with the tip of his sword scraping the wall of the hallway, he brings the blade to her neck. A flare of light bursts from his sword, blinding him as his own yell roars in his ears. Once more, the flare dies, leaving his vision full of black spots. His mind is swirling, the cold stabbing his skin. As he tries to steady himself, his foot catches against his other leg, and he finds himself on the ground, sharp sores opening on his forearms. The spots aren't leaving his vision, and his body refuses to move. The pain on his arms fades, numbness taking over. His breath is shaky, as breathing is all he can do now, as he lays on his front, sword still clasped in his feeble fingers. He doesn't know if he killed the other shadow or not. He doesn't know if the first shadow is still where he lay. All he knows now, as he fades into unconsciousness, is that he's completely out of energy. Chapter 24. The black ice recedes from the walls, and, more importantly, the dilapidated bedroom's doorway, though its strong chill still hangs in the air. Amber forces herself to stand, pushing past her internal pain. Even though she's not experienced with physical injuries, with any luck she'll be feeling better very soon. Until then, the icy knives she breathes in will continue to stab at her chest. She stumbles to the door and yanks it open, the joints of the hinges scraping against each other and creating a high-pitched metallic scream. Beyond, she is met with a cold stone hallway, quiet and still. Cautiously, spear point first, she steps into the hallway and looks around. To her right is inky darkness. To her left, she can just barely make out Lucre's figure laying on the floor, the weak crystal cloud of his breath rising from his head, indicating life. Kimberly's body fills the center of the hallway next to him, part of her arm, and her head turned to dark mist. Amber hurries over to Lucre, golden sparkles shimmering from her fingers in preparation. With it being so dark, she can't see if he has any injuries, though if he has been using his magic, which she figures he has, he'll need that energy injection. She crouches down and touches the young Cerberus's cold arm. His skin under her fingers glows with warm light. As her magic flows into him, a fresh spring running into a dry pond. As she crouches there, waiting for Lucre to recover, her gaze strays to her friend's shadow next to her. Kimberly's arm is slowly starting to reform, the mist banding together once more in long, wispy ribbons. How much longer do they have until Kimberly fully heals herself? What about Jake, assuming that Lucre has injured him in the same way? A small groan emanates from Lucre's throat, and his body begins to slowly shift. Amber drops her spear so that she can help the Cerberus to sit up, careful not to break her connection. His eyes flutter open, his tired gaze inspecting Amber's hand and tracking her arm up to her face. "Amber?" he whispers. "Feeling better?" she asks. The prince nods back at her, rolling his head and blinking furiously to try and wake himself up. "What about Shadow?" he asks, pointing to Kimberly's figure. "I don't know," Amber replies. "What happened to Jake?" Lucre furrows his brow, confused. "The other Shadow," she corrects. "Knocked out?" Amber's stomach sinks. She could hardly stand up to a single twisted shadow, and Lucre can't kill them, if they can even be killed to begin with. They're going to come after them again the moment they heal, and stars only know how Ethan and Blaze are faring back in the throne room, wherever that may be now. "I can try," Lucre speaks, "to kill." "You think you can?" Amber asks him. The Cerberus smiles at her in the dim light of the hallway. "You are here now. We can try." Before Amber can respond, Lucre stands, stumbling a bit before steadying himself with her help. Sword in hand, he plants his feet firmly by the side of Kimberly's chest, and he plunges his blade into the center of her chest. A burst of dark mist erupts around the blade as the fresh injury dissolves into formless air. He takes a deep breath, closing his eyes to focus. Amber's chest flutters as she turns away from her friend's body, anticipating the coming flare, placing her hands on Lucre's shoulders. Her magic swirls inside her, rushing into Lucre as he channels as much of his power into the twisted shadow as he possibly can. Amber's eyelids turn from dark to an intense bright orange. Aside from the bright color, the hallway remains eerily silent, cold drafts continuing to roll over them. Eventually, the light dies out, and Amber cautiously opens her eyes again. The entirety of Kimberly's body is now a formless cloud of darkness. It moves slowly, wrapping around their ankles with its cold embrace as it spreads to cover the ground around them. "Did I do it?" Lucre asks breathlessly. "I don't know," Amber replies. Her hands slip from his shoulders and picks her spear up off the floor. Let's go do it with Jake and get back to the throne room. At least they won't be able to heal in time. Ethan and Shadow dance around each other in the center of the throne room. Shadow's long blade leaves scratches in the stone floor, as Ethan tries his best not to burn Blaze's vines that surround them. Overhead, his friend's vines tremble as they collide with a blanket of darkness that stems from Riona's throne, her staff glowing with bright violet energy as the two engage in a battle of willpower. The battle is infuriatingly unproductive. Each step Ethan manages to take towards the throne, Shadow pushes him back just as far. Every time Shadow tries to strike him, Ethan simply ducks out of the way and blasts it back with his fire. What's the point in fighting? The little voice in his head asks again, as he sidesteps Shadow's swinging blade. Amber may as well be dead, and Lucre only has so much energy to spend. They're not coming. Ethan waves an arm at Shadow, and an arc of flames bursts before him. The fire comes into contact with Shadow's armor and sputters out, leaving behind a small wisp of smoke and a shallow dent that repairs almost instantly. Ice. Ethan stomps the ground, and a wall of ice springs up before him. A mere moment later, the tip of Shadow's sword appears just a hair away from his face. He can't help but let his gaze stray to Riona, overseeing their little brawl with a toothy grin of morbid enjoyment. You don't have to die, you know. Her voice chimes inside of him. Just give up and beg. Shadow frees its sword, retracting it back through the ice while leaving behind a large hole in the wall in its wake, and Ethan draws his attention back to the battle at hand. He takes a step away from the wall as the blade strikes again, this time appearing right where his nose was if he hadn't moved. Storm surges through his limbs, and as Shadow begins to wiggle its sword out of the ice wall once more, Ethan seizes the opportunity and makes a dash towards the throne. Careful! Blaze calls from the back. The darkness above him trembles, bending downwards towards him as he runs. The ground rumbles beneath his feet, and he hears the roar of moving soil as the vines shift into position. Gray vines rush forward ahead of him, keeping a ceiling high enough for him to run under. But the lowering ceiling is the least of his worries. Behind him, he hears the ice wall shatter with a loud, shimmering chime, and Shadow screeches after him. And above, long black spikes begin to pierce through the vines, striking the ground around him, just barely missing his hat and cape. With each new spike, a somewhat stifled grunt of pain emanates from Blaze. The vines, at some point, stop following overhead, and the shadows take the opportunity to begin to close in on Ethan as he leaps and weaves through the dim, perilous corridor. The spikes are just barely managing to keep pace with him, raining down on all sides as he runs, the stone floor cracking as they miss their target. His cape is suddenly snagged, yanking Ethan to a halt by his neck. His legs fly forward, still moving, and thus he lands on the ground on his back, his hat flying off his head as the clasp of his cape presses against his neck. Of the few things he needs to continue to live, breathing is, sadly, one of those requirements. He kicks his legs, attempting to push himself backwards across the floor, as he shoves his thumbs under the clasp of his cape to relieve himself of its pressure, unwilling to remove it as it tries to choke him. Shadow then appears over him, the tip of its sword pointed directly into Ethan's open mouth. Ethan stares up at its unnatural violet eyes, his frantic breaths reflecting off of its blade and back into his own face. He can't yell like this. The word wouldn't come out clear enough to trigger the enchantment on his cape. This is the consequence of your defiance, the voice in his head mocks, a mix of Riona's voice and his own. Death by the hands of your creator. And yet Shadow just stands there, staring downwards wordlessly, the sword slowly trembling in its grasp. Kill him! Riona roars in anger, her voice filling the massive throne room. The tremble of Shadow's sword increases, the flat of its blade rattling against Ethan's teeth. Its eyes narrow into small violet slits as it struggles against itself to try and fulfill her wish. Somewhere in there, Shadow continues to fight. It strains. Illuminate! Comes a sudden cry. Never in his life has he felt so relieved to hear that word as his cape flares once more. Shadow lets out a screech of pain as it staggers backwards, its front side turned to mist. Ethan sits up in an instant and looks in the direction the shout came from. Standing just outside of a small, shadow-hidden doorway, Amber and Lucre stand side by side, not a scratch on either of them to be seen. Amber lowers her free hand that was half-cupped near her mouth, the one who shouted, a smile lighting up her face. His hope fades instantly as he sees Lucre raise his sword, sand swirling to create the head of his wand, a white glow at its tip aimed directly at Shadow. Panic stings his chest. His cape may only be able to harm Shadow temporarily, but pure light magic can certainly kill it. Words caught in his damaged throat, Ethan lunges at Shadow's legs, tackling it to the ground. No sooner does his other half land on its back, a beam of light streaks over them, piercing Riona's magic. Not Shadow! Ethan finally yells. Her! Lucre's attention snaps to Riona in an instant, and Amber steps forward to place her hand on his shoulder, giving him a magic boost. Still with Amber by his side, Lucre appears to be wilting, his shoulders hanging low as his chest puffs with each of his labored breaths. He might have 1 or 2 more bursts of energy left in him before he passes out for good. The ground quakes beneath the castle's stone flooring, and Blaze's vines surge forward once more, reaching over Ethan and Shadow and branching towards Amber and Lucre, as Riona releases a second wave of shadow tendrils. What a gross misuse of his own magic, only using a single spell she obtained thousands of years ago. As the vines come down to shield the two beings, just for a moment there is silence. Ethan can't help but let out a heavy sigh, slowly rising to rest next to Shadow on his knees. His whole body aches in a way he's not experienced before, his entire front side charred somehow. Each breath he takes is slow and laborious, the air passing through his injured throat. Cautiously, he rubs where the clasp of his cape struck him. On the floor next to him, Shadow coughs coarsely and also rubs its neck, violet still shining through half-closed eyes. Ethan, it rasps, its gaze landing on the spiritist. You... Ethan pats Shadow's hand that still lays by its side. I wasn't going to leave you here. Your scar... Shame begins to well inside Ethan's chest. Don't, he replies, standing. He raises his hands to his cape's clasp and unlocks it, letting the old piece of fabric fall from his shoulders. It wasn't your fault. Storm. Lightning sparks off his robe. Black spikes begin to poke through the vines around them, and somewhere behind him Blaze cries out in pain as the damage to the vines recoils back onto him. Slowly, the vines begin to curl upwards as they begin to die. With a burst of new energy, Ethan dashes under the vines, his focus on the throne only a few feet away from him. Out of the corner of his eye, he can see Amber waving her spear around awkwardly, her other hand fixed to one of Lucre's shoulders. Any sort of darkness that gets too close to the two, she swipes at it, keeping it at bay as best she can manage. What remains of Blaze's vines circle the two as well, protecting them from as many black spikes as they can possibly hold back. Lucre stands as strong as he can amidst the chaos, channeling another burst of light into his wand to fire at Riona. Ethan might not be able to take Riona down himself, but at least he can try and draw her attention away from Lucre. Once more, the spikes rain down around Ethan as he runs, though this time they have little to latch onto to keep him back as he dances between them. For a brief moment, his gaze locks with Riona's, and her sneer twists into a hateful, rage-filled scowl. Whatever few good times he remembers sharing with her, her face says it all. She never truly cared about him or Shadow. She points her staff at him and screeches at the top of her lungs, "Stop!" No sooner is the word spoken, the deep chill of paralysis begins to sink into his body. Ice. In a desperate move, Ethan leaps, a pillar of ice appearing beneath his foot, giving him as much height as he can manage. As he rises into the air, all feeling in his legs disappears. Fire. He brings his arms up as fast as he can, just as his fingers go numb, freezing over with the command. And yet the fire swirls around them regardless, the unbridled power of the spirit already coursing through his empty shell. He wills a burst of fire to leave his palms, aimed directly at Riona as his ascent finally slows, his body no longer responding to his commands for it to move. The fire streaks through the air, hurtling towards the crazed wizard. She raises a hand, and a wall of darkness cloaks her figure. Predictably, the flames lick at her barrier hopelessly. And yet, a second beam of light fires, piercing through Riona's barrier. A single, shrill note of surprise escapes the darkness, echoing throughout the castle before falling silent. The moment the shriek dies once and for all, Ethan feels the rush of air against his skin as he falls, Riona's command losing all hold on his being. Ice. A pillar rises to greet him, breaking his fall. All around him, the darkness Riona summoned to protect her begins to fade away, turning to mist and dissipating in an invisible wind. He sees Amber supporting a weak Lucre, keeping him from collapsing to the ground as he grips his wand with the last of his strength. Turning around, Blaze is curled up on the ground, his arms wrapped around his chest as he rocks back and forth, a soft green light escaping his fingers as he nurses his own wounds. The throne finally reveals itself. All there's left of Riona is a collection of violet sparkles, an air of anger left in her wake as her spirit lingers. Her staff lays at its foot, masterless, its gemstone pulsing softly with magic, Ethan's magic. He jumps down from his ice pillar and steps up to the throne as the last of the violet sparkles that once made up Riona's figure blows away with her darkness. She's gone. He never thought he would see the cycle. So why does he feel so hollow? To his left, he sees Shadow appear at his side, also staring at the empty throne with a tired gaze, the violet finally gone from its eyes. They pulse a bright red, as they should, its form nearly healed once more. "I'm sorry," it says. Ethan wraps an arm around Shadow's shoulders, pulling it close. "So am I." Shadow twists and gives Ethan a hug, a wave of emotion washing over him. Hope, happiness, shame, anger, relief. They all clash together, swirling, trying to make sense of themselves in a storm that threatens to crush his empty figure. The only thing he can do is hug back. "I missed you," Shadow whispers, its voice choked, clutching Ethan as hard as it can. "I missed you more," Ethan replies, his forced chuckle coming out as a strained whimper instead. He doesn't mind. He has Shadow back, and that's all he cares about right now. Finally, the two release, and Ethan finds himself staring at his double, a mirror of himself in blacks and grays, cape and hat aside. Shadow smiles, its mouth a bright white gap between its lips. "We're free now, right?" it asks. Ethan nods. "We are." He bends down and picks up Riona's staff. The shaft is cold in his hands, and he can feel the heavy pressure of ethereal power radiating from it. He holds it out to Shadow. "It's yours, after all." Wordlessly, Shadow accepts the staff and weighs it in his hands, mesmerized by the chains that wrap around it, both of them now fractured to pieces. "Can we be rid of it?" it inquires. Ethan shakes his head. Riona was the only one who could remove it forever. Shadow just sighs tiredly, shifting its weight. He understands its disappointment. He doesn't want to be stuck with his phantom shackles either, but sadly that's not how the spell worked. "I will have our magic returned," it hums at last. "I don't know how long it'll take." Ethan nods, turning away from Shadow. "We'll leave when you're done." He makes his way down from the dais and approaches Amber and Lucre, who now sits on the ground with his eyes closed. "How is he doing?" he asks as he nears. Amber looks up from Lucre and, without warning, leaps forward and wraps her arms around his neck. With a smile, he reciprocates her kind gesture. "Thank you," he adds as they separate. "I didn't mean to get you this involved, and yet here we are." "I know," Amber replies with a small nod. She gestures to Lucre and continues. "He's spent. The magic injections finally took their toll on him." "I see." Ethan approaches the young prince and kneels before him, causing the Cerberus to lift his head. Ethan gives him a thankful grin. "You did well, Lucre." Lucre smiles back at him. Happy to help." "Do you think you can stand?" Lucre shakes his head. "No." As his one-note moan fades, his stomach growls quite loudly, a small clap of thunder. The prince lifts his free hand to his stomach. "I'm hungry too," Amber comments with a light laugh. "Well," Ethan hums, peering over his shoulder. Shadow stands at the throne with Riona's staff still, its eyes closed, focused. "When Shadow is done, we'll go to Asandra." "Asandra?" Lucre echoes. "I agree," Amber says, patting the prince's shoulder. "A senior healer should make sure you didn't harm yourself with all your magic use." Lucre lets out a tired moan, which rumbles in his throat, but he doesn't retort beyond that. Ethan wouldn't be surprised if he's secretly looking forward to seeing another island of Astria that isn't Mirage. Suddenly, a deep rumble shakes the castle, causing the stones to grate and dust to fall. Ethan whirls around as Amber and Lucre raise their heads. In the great emptiness of the throne room center, a large ball of dense shadow gathers, growing by the moment. It absorbs what little light there still is. As the cycle outside the castle fades fast into the darkness of night, appearing as a flat disk when it is, in actuality, a sphere. Eventually, the rumbling ceases as the sphere of magic hovers in the air, its presence a great weight that presses down on his shoulders, trying to crush him with its sheer might. Amber shifts in a sort of brace position, clutching her spear close to her chest. Shadow, staff in hand, steps up to the sphere, its expression unreadable. With its free hand, it reaches up, a single finger extended, and presses it against the condensed magic before it. Soundlessly, as soon as Shadow touches it, the sphere trembles and shifts, slowly being drawn into Shadow's figure. It elongates and shrinks as it's absorbed, returning to its rightful owner. At the same time, Ethan can feel it, this rush of magic filling the hollow cavity of his chest, like water filling a bucket. It's a sharp, clear, refreshing chill as it courses through his body. The air that flows through his nose as he inhales has a different smell to it, sweet and clear. With the slightest twitch of his body, he can sense the shadows around him bend and mold to mimic his every gesture. He exhales through his mouth, the buzz of magic brushing past his lips. The sensation of magic subsides, settling into the familiar rhythm of its pulse, filling his body with its essence. He smiles, the smooth curve naturally forming across his face, as he watches the staff in Shadow's hand turns to dust, the last remnant of Riona disappearing forever. Chapter 25. Ethan's dark double floats. Yes, floats. Over to Amber, Ethan, and Lucre, and holds its hand out to her. She can't help but flick her eyes from its hand to its feet, which are raised a good couple of inches off the ground. "Shadow," it says with a gleaming white smile, its lips not once parting as it speaks. "Amber," she replies cautiously, shaking its hand. Its dark gray skin is cold to the touch, and she lets go quickly as the chill begins to burn her hand. She musters an apologetic smile as Shadow stares at her with a mildly hurt expression. "You're just so cold." "Lucre," the prince pipes up from the ground, reaching up to Shadow to shake its hand as well. "I'm sorry," it says as it finishes shaking Lucre's hand. "I didn't mean to cause so much trouble." Amber nods. "I understand. Are you from Asandra?" "I am, yes." Curiosity sparkles in Shadow's crimson gaze, and it leans in and closer to her. "What's it like? Has it changed much?" Her gaze strays to Ethan, who stands off to the side as he tries to cover his own wide smile with one of his fists. "I don't know what to say." "She's not as old as us." Ethan finally speaks up, a light chuckle in his voice. The culture has changed, but the buildings haven't. With that, Shadow backs away from Amber once more, its curiosity dulling ever so slightly. I see. Amber looks down at Shadow's lack of contact with the ground once more. Wizards aren't supposed to be able to fly, so seeing a floating being is odd, to say the very least. Does this mean Ethan can float too? If you're finished, then we can get going to Ica now, Ethan adds, placing a hand on the Shadow's shoulder. The sooner we leave, the sooner we can get to Assandra's many cafes. That seems to perk Shadow up, and it rises in the air with its white grin widening with eagerness. You can carry the prince, Ethan gestures to Lucre. Then the husk turns to Amber. Mind going with me? Amber can only grin back at him awkwardly. Not really? Shadow scoops Lucre off the ground and hovers above the two wizards below. Lucre peers down at the ground with wide eyes, both filled with awe and fear. Ethan, on the other hand, begins to stride over to where his hat and cape lay in the middle of the throne room. Amber, not having anything better to do, trots after him. Can you fly? Amber asks. Well, I wouldn't call it flying, Ethan chuckles. I can't reach the stars, sadly. Could you always fly? Ethan picks up his cape and fiddles with the clasp. I could, but then Riona took that away. She took a lot from us, but never really did anything with them herself. He plucks his hat from the ground and adjusts it on his head. Maybe she couldn't even use them, or maybe she didn't even care to try. The four make their way to the throne room's entrance, Shadow and Lucre floating overhead as Amber walks behind Ethan and his cape. A large hole now pierces the middle of the stitched rune of light as the thin, threaded diamond shimmers back at her. As they pass through the small entranceway, Amber can't help but look back at the empty throne room that they're leaving behind. Some being seems to be missing. Where'd Blaze go? She asks. Released, Ethan replies. Back to his body. Oh. You sound disappointed. Amber presses her lips together. She is disappointed. Somewhat. He had been so nice, and a part of her wanted to thank him for that before he left. Though that's too late now. I was just wondering, she replies quietly. Finally, they step out of the castle to a much different corridor than when they first arrived. The clouds in the sky are gone, revealing the stars with all their majesty glittering high above them, nightfall settling in quickly. And where the land was once dead and barren, the plains and tree-lined paths are full of greenery and life. Empty dirt fields are surrounded with grass and wildflowers. The trees are now dressed with vibrant leaves that sway in some magical breeze they can't feel. A couple are decorated with small pink spots, which Amber can only assume are blooming fruit flowers. It's green as far as she can see, all signs of Riona's dark influence completely gone. Off to the left rises a bright golden wall that glitters with the same beauty as the stars in the sky. It's so large that it fills her entire vision, her mind trying to process all of the glittering beauty that seems to stretch on endlessly in every direction. Behind the silver gold shimmering is a plain of bright blue that bobs up and down playfully, like waves. Wow, Lucre gasps in awe. It's beautiful, isn't it? Ethan asks, also taking in the sight, his black eyes seeming to steal the glow of the wall as they reflect its bright color. Yeah, Amber breathes back. She never knew that Corridon used to look like this. What is that? Lucre asks slowly. That, Ethan points to the wall, is the border barrier. I figured, Amber can't help but comment. We learned a bit about it, but... Her voice fades, her words quickly leaving her mind. Seeing the real thing before her is different from reading about it in a textbook. It appeared after the Great War ended. Ethan continues, talking to Lucre. It created the void and kept us safe for all these millennia. Corridon is the only island you can see it from. But Riona didn't like looking at it as much as she didn't like us stargazing, so she hid it with clouds and darkness. Oh, Lucre mutters downheartedly. With that, Ethan turns to Amber and holds his hand out to her. Ready to go home? Amber's heart flutters. Going home. Back to ASM and her studies, seeing Kimberly and Jake, working until she can afford her second term. With the massive gap in her memory still, it feels like her school life thus far is the life she's only ever known. Her stomach cuts through her thoughts with a loud rumble, and an aching soreness begins to take hold of her limbs. No matter how long it's been since she left Cassandra, she'll be happy to sleep in a proper bed again and stuff herself full of sandwiches. Slowly, she takes his hand. He grips her tight, to the point where it feels like he's going to crush her bones if he presses any harder, and effortlessly lifts the both of them into the air. Her feet kick at the air below her in surprise. Next to her, Shadow appears in the air, Lucre still in its arms. We won't be up here very long, Ethan assures Amber. She watches Corridon streak by below her, as Ethan and Shadow float side by side, her hair whipping around behind her as they go. I've got a lot of places to take you, Shadow, Ethan says. Will I be able to eat cake? Shadow asks hopefully. Yes, you'll be able to eat as much cake as you want, Ethan laughs back. But I've got a few affairs to get in order first before we can do anything else. Shadow lets out an airy huff. Riona's finally gone and you still have work to do. It's expressing gratitude more than work. I don't expect it to take very long. Then we can go and get cake. The two begin to slow and lower themselves to the ground as they come upon the archway of Ica. The small city is quiet and empty as they land, no Fenny waiting to greet them, shadows or otherwise. Where did all the Fenny go? Amber asks as she regains her footing on the ground. They're probably still getting used to being in their bodies again, Ethan replies, digging around in his pockets. It's been, 2 decades for some of them? Longer for others. He pulls out a small white stone and holds it up to the archway, which hums and glows in its presence. The rip that opens reveals a quiet, Asandra School of Magic campus. It'll take a while for Corridon to get back on its feet anyway. Crops don't grow in a cycle, even with magic. After you. He gestures towards the archway with his free hand. Amber nods and steps through, now staring at the dorm rooms and the ring of halls before her. It feels so strange to suddenly be back on campus after everything she's been through. The other 3 should still be in the infirmary, Ethan says, appearing next to her, Shadow standing next to him. You should probably go tell Asna that you're okay. Amber blinks in surprise, the statement catching her off guard. I should? Well, you did disappear rather suddenly. She purses her lips. He does have a point. Wordlessly, Ethan leads the way through campus, with Amber and Shadow drifting behind him. This place hasn't changed much, Shadow says. Have you been here before? Amber can't help but ask. It was a long time ago. Shadow replies, its face scrunching up uncomfortably. But I mostly saw through Ethan's eyes. Shadow wasn't allowed to leave Corridon. Ethan throws over his shoulder. It's not been back to Asandra for a couple thousand years at this point. Oh, Amber mutters quietly. I'm sorry. Shadow half-heartedly smiles back at her, but doesn't say anything more, its attention quickly being drawn back to the buildings around it. They leave campus and walk down the pathway towards the infirmary, nighttime quickly setting in around them. The stars sharpen, glowing down upon them with their full fury, guiding them to the doorway. Ethan? Comes a cry of surprise the moment Ethan opens the door. Then Amber steps in, and she sees Claire shoot up from her seat at the reception desk, her eyes wide with surprise. Amber! The enchanter steps away from her desk and rushes up to Amber, throwing her arms around Amber's neck and hugging her tight. Oh, thank the stars you're okay, Claire says, her entire body shaking. When she pulls away from Amber, her eyes are wet with tears. When you went missing, I thought... Amber offers Claire a small smile. Well, I came back in one piece, didn't I? Her eyes dart over to Shadow, who still holds Lucre in its arms. The prince musters a smile and a small, weak wave. But he's suffered a lot of magic deficit. I want to make sure he's not injured himself too badly. She points to the Cerberus. Claire's head snaps to Lucre, then jumps back when she finally notices Shadow. Escapes her mouth as she processes Ethan's dark twin. Shadow just smiles back at Claire somewhat weakly. Claire? Amber asks the receptionist. The wizard blinks once and shakes her head free of her spell, straightening her posture to regain her composure. Right, she starts, turning to Ethan. If you want to see Asna, he's with your friends. They woke up not that long ago, and the entire infirmary got sent into a bit of an uproar. Amber, we can take, those two to a room. There should be some vacant ones nearby. Amber nods. Thanks, Claire. Claire only smiles back at her weakly, her eyes still scanning the ragtag group before her. I'll see you later, Amber says to Ethan as she passes him, Shadow floating by her side. He tips his hat back at her. Come stop by when you can. I'll try. This way, Claire directs, the three entering the long white halls of the infirmary. Healers are rushing about frantically as they attempt to navigate to an empty room. Eventually, Claire manages to open a door, and the two girls and one fragment Shadow duck inside, with Lucre quietly observing from Shadow's arms. The room is quiet compared to the hallway outside, with a bed and chair already set up against the back wall. I'll go find a senior healer, Claire announces, quickly ducking out into the fray of the hallway before Amber can say anything back to her. You can place him on the bed, Amber tells Shadow, waving to the bed. It nods, setting the Cerberus down as gently as it can. Lucre lets out a yawn the moment he's out of Shadow's arms. It's cold. Amber nods. Yes, Sandra is often chilly. Lucre doesn't seem to be listening to her, instead shifting on the bed to lay on his side, his legs turning into his tail with ease. He curls into a small circle around his tail and lets out a heavy huff, falling asleep in an instant. Shadow mutters, its eyes wide. A tinge of distress begins to fill the air around it. It's fine, she assures it. Lucre sleeps when he gets too cold. Ah, Shadow sighs, thankfully. Ethan Nightshade, what in Astria is happening? Ethan musters a small smile. Hello to you too, Blaze. Blaze is the only one out of bed, but Kimberly is awake as well. Jake, however, is missing from the room entirely. I've been stuck in here for almost 8 whole cycles now, Blaze cries. 8! And where have you been all that time? Before you go tearing the infirmary down, Kimberly says from her bed, propping herself up against the backboard, how about you give Ethan some space to explain? Ugh, Blaze sighs, placing one hand on his forehead and the other on his hip. Clearly, he's not very pleased and has lots of questions. He just doesn't want to be patient about getting the answers he quite clearly deserves. Ethan laughs back at him. I'll tell you everything I know in a moment, Blaze. But first, where's Jake? He started coughing up blood as soon as he woke up, so they moved him to another room. Kimberly explains, gripping her bed sheets nervously. Her brow furrows, fear filling her tired eyes. Hasna said he's just got some magic sickness and needs some time to collect himself, but... She trails off, her mind wandering. Ethan nods slowly. Jake having magic sickness that violently is worrying indeed. His magic will return. As for his health after that, I can't really say. He's quite resilient, though. He'll tough it out. A small smile of comfort briefly flickers across Kimberly's lips, and she relaxes her hold on her sheets. Okay, Eth, now tell us what happened to us. Blaze steps in forcefully, folding his arms. Ethan scowls back at his friend in confusion. You don't remember? Blaze lets out a snort and deadpans. Should I? Well, yes. There's a slight buzz in the back of his head as he feels Shadow's attention turn to him. Its presence is usually not so uncomfortable. Riona didn't do anything with his shadow as far as I'm aware. Shadow says, its voice ringing in his head. He ran before she could. What about you, Kim? Ethan asks. Kimberly looks Ethan in the eye quietly, her expression unreadable. Her eyes say it all. She remembers things she doesn't want to know about. The castle, the twisting, and stars only know what else. There was a fight, she says, her gaze drifting to Blaze. You were there. I was? He asks, puzzled. Your shadow was, Ethan replies. Your body was here, in the infirmary. All hollowed out, right? Excuse me? Did you think I was asleep the entire time? Blaze scoffs. You and Asna and that girl were all talking in here at some point about us being hollowed out. Am I right or wrong? Ethan glowers back at Blaze, releasing a cold blast of magic. That girl has a name, you know. So, Blaze retorts. Ethan, just answer his question. Kimberly sighs hopelessly. Yes, you heard correctly. Ethan answers through gritted teeth. Somehow. Before anything else can happen, the door to the room opens once more. Ethan turns to the newcomer, half expecting it to be Asna. After all, he has yet to speak with the Fenny. But he still smiles when Amber steps in, her eyes dreary. Behind her, the dark shadow she casts shifts ever so slightly. Shadow hiding in plain sight. Lucre is being cared for, she tells him. Ethan lets out a thankful breath. That's good to hear. I'll take him home when he's feeling better. Amber then turns to Kimberly and waves. Hi, Kimstar. You look terrible, Amber. Kimberly chuckles back. It's just events catching up with me, the healer replies with a shoulder shrug. I'll be happier when I get some sleep in a proper bed. Her gaze strays over to Blaze, and she pulls a strained smile. The other life wizard just scowls back at her, appearing to be picking his words carefully. I've got nothing to say to the likes of you. I thought so, Amber hums sadly. Where's Jake? Not feeling too well, Kimberly replies flatly. I see. He'll be fine, Ethan reassures Kimberly once more. Amber shifts her weight and looks around the room. It looks like there's not much else for me to do here, which is surprising, seeing as the hall is still in chaos. I think they're all looking for excuses to stay late, Ethan replies with a grin. Well, I'm not certainly looking for any right now. I think I'm going to go and get some rest. Have a good night, you three. Ethan pats her shoulder on the way out. You did well, Amber. You should probably worry about yourself, she replies with a small chuckle. And with that, she is gone. I would like to go get some rest myself, Ethan says, turning to his friends. Though not specifically tired, he certainly needs a bit of time to let his mind process, and for him and Shadow to spend some well-needed quality time together. When do you think you three will be out? Probably as soon as they come back, Blaze huffs, still slightly irritated. At first light, Kimberly predicts, and Jake probably next evening. I'll drop by at first light to check on you then, Ethan nods. Rest well. You'll need it. Epilogue. Ethan specifically picked the window seat to stare out of as he waits. Through one eye, he watches beings wander up and down the straightway, first terms chatting happily as second terms trudge off to class. Through the other eye, he watches shadows zoom between patches of darkness, inspecting the beings with a great curiosity. It doesn't stay still for long, always moving after a spell to get a new angle on the view. Once again, he should be used to this, but instead he finds it disorientingly familiar. He remembers doing this all the time in the past, but now it's been so long since he's been able to that he's forgotten what it felt like. A flash of pink grabs Ethan's attention, making him sit up in his seat and bringing all of his attention to the small cafe, Shadow's view fading away. Amber is smiling, dragging along a wide-eyed Lucre behind her. Ethan raises a hand in the window, drawing the first term's attention. She waves back, acknowledging his presence, then turns to Lucre to direct him to the cafe. They're here, he says to Shadow. No sooner does he finish his thought, Shadow melts out of the darkness with a wide grin of its own, as it takes one of the 3 empty seats at Ethan's table. Had fun? He asks. Shadow nods back. So much has changed. It sure has. Ethan agrees quietly. Here's a chair for you. He hears Amber speak as she and Lucre approach. Amber pulls out one of the other two chairs, just enough to where Lucre can sit down, then helps him do so. Even though the young prince appears to be fine on the surface, his tired gaze tells a different story. How is he doing? Ethan asks as Amber takes her own seat. He's all right, but he's been told to take it easy, Amber replies with a sad sigh. Hasna said that his magic needs a bit of time to settle in again on its own. He's allowed to roam, so long as he sits down occasionally and travels with a healer. Wizards make miracles, Lucre chuckles weakly. Amber nods to him. That's our job. Well, Ethan speaks up, I thought I'd take the time to celebrate while we still can. And with Shadow begging to have some cake, I thought this was the perfect place. Cake? Lucre asks, adding yet another word to his growing vocabulary. Shadow can't help but gasp with childish delight, eager to have found another being as out of their depth as it. You've not had cake either? Lucre shakes his head. I don't think so. Ethan reaches for a menu from the stack that lay in the center of the table and slides one to Lucre. Why don't you take a look at what they have to offer? Amber quietly takes a menu of her own, with Shadow making no move to take the fourth. Ethan doesn't really need to look at the menu, as he already knows what he wants. He's doing it for Shadow. Lazy, he mutters behind the menu, shooting Shadow a small glare. Shadow just smiles back at him playfully. Many cafes offer cake as a small treat, but this one in particular serves the best, in Ethan's opinion. After eating up and down the straight way for just over 1,000 years, he feels like he knows what he's talking about, though his opinion only stems from one cake in particular, rose cake. If they serve bad rose cake, then it's a bad place to have cake. And that one is just a simple vanilla cake, Amber says, helping Lucre navigate the somewhat lengthy menu. We have vanilla, Lucre announces proudly, finally finding something he recognizes. Amber can't help but let out a light laugh in reply. A wizard dressed in purple and white approaches the table, smiling down at the customers while cautiously eyeing Shadow. Are you four ready to order? I'll take a slice of rose cake, Ethan starts, looking to Shadow. Whatever he's having, Shadow says with a playful smile. The wizard nods once, his smile straining as he writes on a small pad of paper. Shadow's presence must unnerve the waiter, especially with Ethan sitting right next to it. I'd like an Orabo lime slice, please, Amber says, her gaze darting from the waiter to Lucre. Lucre stares back at her, appearing mildly confused. Tell him what you want. Oh, he mutters, his head bowing to hide in his menu. Vanilla. Cake, Amber adds quickly for clarification. The waiter just chuckles to himself as he finishes scribbling down the group's request. Your order will be ready shortly. He holds out a hand, waiting for the menus to be returned. Ethan passes his over, along with the unused one in the middle of the table. Amber hands hers over after, then slowly plucks Lucre's from his hands. Cafe property in hand, the waiter turns and strides over to the front counter, where all the cakes sit in a little ice glass display. What are you going to do now, Eth? Amber asks. Ethan folds his arms and leans back in his chair. There's a lot he needs to do. It's just a matter of which order he does it. Well, I know what I'm not going to do. What? Go back to ASM. Amber presses her lips together, her brow furrowing into concern. Why? Ethan half smiles back at the first term. I only needed the schooling for housing this time. The curriculum has hardly changed over the centuries, so I know everything. So I've known everything for a long time. Frankly, the school has been boring, if anything. Even so, I won't have any time to focus on schoolwork now anyway. I need to speak with Tatcha, Kaza, Belle, Asna, maybe even the council. Riona left behind a mess bigger than you might think, and I need to help clean it up. Amber nods slowly. Don't put too much pressure on yourself, Eth. I'll still visit, Ethan assures her. That's... The healer pauses, considering her words, then caps her decision off with a small sigh. Okay. That's okay. It's just going to be a lot of talking, Amber. I don't think it'll be too much physical work. Ethan looks down at the table, pressing his thumbs together anxiously. He hopes he'll be able to do some physical work. From the lessons he's learned, one of them is that words only go so far, and he's never been one for the political game. Just then, the waiter returns with their cakes, the 4 plates all crammed together on one black tray, fighting for space. One by one, he places the cake slices on the table before each being, smiling all the while. Thank you, Amber says to them with a warm smile. Enjoy your food, the waiter only replies, quickly rushing away to care for another table. Her Orabo Lime's cake consists of a light green-colored sponge and a bright orange layer of frosting. Lucre's vanilla cake is a bright white, complete with a small chocolate topper of a white diamond and black circle, the symbols of light and shadow in their most basic forms. It's the little details that make Ethan feel warm inside. And speaking of details, there's a reason why he loves rose cake so much. It's a cake made of shades of red and sculpted into the shape of a flower petal. Not only does it taste good, but it looks amazing when made right. This is why rose cake is his trusty benchmark. Wow, Shadow breathes, inspecting its own piece of rose cake with wide eyes. It's beautiful. It's all about presentation, Ethan replies with a smirk. He picks up his fork and takes the first bite. The flavor is a melt-in-your-mouth chocolate taste, mixing with the light top cream of dyed vanilla. It's both rich and subtle at the same time, and lingers in one's mouth for an age afterwards. Amber also gets to eating her own treat as Lucre cautiously plays with his plate, as if expecting the cake to spring up and attack. And Shadow, "You're done?" he asks in surprise, noting Shadow's plate is now suddenly empty and impeccably spotless. "I see why you enjoy it so much," Shadow grins back, patting its stomach. "Very delicious." "I thought you'd savor it a little more than that," Ethan replies with a huff. Shadow just rolls its eyes back at him. "Are you going to eat that?" Amber asks, waving her fork towards Lucre's cake. The prince perks up for a moment, quiet as he looks at her with wide eyes, then slowly slides his plate closer to himself. "Mine," he states. He finally digs his fork into the tip of the cake and shoves the tiny bite into his mouth as if to prove a point. His face goes from firm to confused, and finally to delight as the flavor slowly takes hold of him. Ethan leans back in his chair, looking at the table, and he can't help but feel at ease. For once, he's able to relax and indulge in something he likes with friends he enjoys being around. He has Shadow back, he finally has his freedom and magic back, and he's found beings he can fully open up to. It feels magical. Shadow can't help but let out a small snicker next to him, which he ignores through frowning and shooting it a sideways glare. Yes, Life has only gotten better. The end. And that's it. That's Shadowbound. We're done. Oh boy. Wow. It has been a long series of streams. However, I do hope you enjoyed. If you are watching this live and you have been here for all of the live streams, thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here. I was not sure how many people would watch until the end. And I know that not everyone can make it to every day. So if you've been here for every single day, you deserve to make yourself a cake or some cookies or something. Treat yourself. But now we are in the Q&A portion. So, questions, comments, theories for the next book, because there have been some things that have been set up. Yes, Echo, I know you've been here. And also be sure to thank Echo for all of the wonderful drawings that she has done each and every reading stream. She is a trooper, to be sure. And while you all have your brains percolating with stuff for me to comment on, I'm going to take a sip of water. I'm so happy and excited I swallowed my water wrong. I love Blaze so much. Dude, I think Blaze was very fun. Like, in the end. Just, going from, don't worry guys, I'll protect you, to, what the hell happened? How do you like the ending? Ooh. The ending. I would say that, for when I was writing it, I liked it. But, of course, looking back on it now, could absolutely have done it a little bit better. Especially the final fight, too. Like, I'll admit, it did kind of go by super fast. Part of it was I didn't really know what else to do with it. I wanted it to be longer, but at the same time, like, I already had everything that I wanted in it, so if I just extended it, it would, like, I worried that I would have made it sound weird or I would have broken it. So it's like, yeah, it's gonna be quick. I mean, in the old version of Shadowbound, it was about that quick too. If not quicker. So this version of it is actually a little bit more drawn out. But all in all, I do think it's a nice ending. Again, I did my best with it. This one was really, really hard to end, in all honesty. Because the old draft ended with just the end of the fight. And, fun fact, the castle actually crumbled in that version. So, it was kind of like a somber, the party succeeds, and now they're just kind of sitting on top of the ruins of the castle. And it fades to black. And then the second book opened with their return to Asandra. So them returning to Asandra in this draft was awkward to put a cap on. I feel like I did a good job for what I gave myself to work with. Can it be improved upon? Yes, but for what it's worth right now, I'd say it's a good ending. Now, I know I've talked about the old draft of Shadowbound in the past. A lot of the current scenes in the published version are actually recycled from the old version. So a lot of salvaging going on. The only thing I couldn't exactly salvage was the final fight. Now, the structure of it was roughly the same as the old draft, like Amber with Kim, Lucre with Blaze, not Blaze, Jake, and then Blaze and Ethan at least being in the room together. But in the old draft, Blaze was actually on the enemy team. That's a longer discussion right there. But he wasn't supposed to be with the other three. Blaze was a very last minute addition. So Blaze being on their team, that changed a lot. And then the mechanics of how Shadow and Ethan worked, since I changed that from the first draft, I needed to change how that worked. Jake used to be the good one. Jake didn't even go with them. Like, yes, there was a time in, like, the old, Shadowbound where, yes, Jake was the one that was freed first, and he joined the guys. But I couldn't fit him in the final fight cleanly, so I think I just sent him home. Like, yay, you're free, now go home and we'll deal with the rest. But then in draft 1 of Shadowbound, he wasn't. He was a shadow up until the end. And in this one, same deal. Still a shadow up until the end. But Blaze was the only one that changed allegiances. How long after will the second take place? Only a couple of months. Like, this is the midterm right now. And so the second book's gonna be closer to Kimberly's graduation. Not quite there, like graduation's not gonna be a huge deal, but she is being prepared for it. Sounds like a Blaze thing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, like, dude, the old draft of Shadowbound, I guess I can talk about that now. Um, the old draft of Shadowbound. Couple of things different about it. So number one, Ethan and Shadow were one entity, not two. Two minds in a body. Change two was Ethan could see the spirit, which manifested in like these magical auras. That got removed because it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And how that played into the old script. Yeah, I know there's sirens. Come on, emergencies happen all the time. Oh, and how the auras played into the script. It wasn't much, but um the spirit and the shadow are attached to each other. So even in shadow form, like if they were hiding or something in a dark corner, Ethan could have seen them because he can see the auras of magical creatures. If you don't have magic, you don't have an aura. You still have a spirit. It just doesn't emit anything he can see. And Blaze was the only shadow that he couldn't see because Blaze, for whatever reason, didn't have an aura. And that was supposed to be significant. However, I did not make it significant whatsoever because I was a dumb young writer who didn't know how to make things significant. So it was just kind of like a detail that I threw in there because I thought it was fun. And it only came back, like, the detail was only useful maybe once or twice. After that, like, it didn't really change anything. Um, Fights still played out the same way. Like, you know, a bunch of stuff happened that it's like, if he didn't see auras, then, like, it wouldn't have been a big deal. So I took that out. What else did I change? Oh, so the whole Mirage scene, the entirety of the second act, originally it took place over a month. You know, now it takes place in a matter of like 2 or 3 cycles. But in the old draft, it was like Amber went to Mirage, was found by Luke, and she was on Mirage for a whole entire month with her missing memories. The memory thing has always been in there. And there's a cut scene that was about a big sandboarding race. Used to be longer too, yeah. Because of the sandboarding race and stuff like that. Like, all that had to happen in the old draft. So Amber went and did this big race that the Cerberus put on. And they still do it. It's just, it's not in this book. Oh, yeah, like the old version. Dude, she basically grew up on Mirage and in some versions as well. I'm talking strictly about the first draft versus the published draft. Let's not complicate things too much. So in the old draft, she did a sandboarding race, and the winner of the sandboarding race was allowed to spend a couple nights at the palace for whatever reason. And she won, so she went to the palace, and that was how Ethan was able to get Amber and Luke on board with running away to Corridon. Because initially it was like, sure, Luke snuck out of the house still, but it wasn't like, he wasn't always there, and he was really hard to get to. So I didn't know how to get the two of them in the same room for then Ethan to show up and be like, hey, we gotta go, there's danger about. So I did this whole race thing that led to this palace thing, and then Luke and Amber explored the palace a little bit. They found an abandoned room. There were some letters that they read that was a setup for the second book that totally didn't belong in the draft, honestly. And and then Ethan shows up just out of the blue, and he's like, let's go to Corridon, and they're all like, yeah, sure, but I'm oversimplifying it, but how that all happened was so stupid. Just take my word for it. Yeah, so a lot of that stuff got cut because it was just too unrealistic and wild and it did not work. I will say his Ethan's exposition dumps used to be a lot longer and more chunky and more confusing. Oh, yeah. Uh Amber in the very, 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 very distant past could absorb the sun, but that was more out of a technical limitation because that was a different rendition where I turned it into an actual. You guys, I turned one of the drafts of Shadowbound into like a movie, a feature length movie animated with this program called Gotcha Life. And I worked on it for a good solid couple of months. It was just my obsession, and I deleted it because it was. Can you believe that thing was like 5 GB? And I edited it all on Movie Maker too. So that was more out of a technical limitation. That isn't even like written down anywhere. Absorb the sun. Yes, that was just that. We don't talk about that in great detail because I just talked about it. Um, so unfortunately, that's lost media. I never posted the thing anywhere. I had to break it up into like 4 or 5 different parts because Movie Maker wouldn't export the entire hour and a half animation. It was so dorky too. It was long. I had to chop it up into like 15-20 minute portions. But I did have the whole thing in one project too. Yes. Okay, Echo, you have art to get back to. Thank you. uh I know I mentioned the crystal balls. Okay. Okay. Talked about the crystal balls, talked about Ethan, how he used to work, talked about Mirage. Uh, what else? Talked about the shack and also the setting, the old setting becoming the ruins. Amber's healing ability used to be different. Oh, yeah, right. So, also, how Amber used to work was. And I was still caught up in this whole, um, like, this other completely different magic system where everything was like, ranked based on rarity or number or whatever, and but like everyone had like a baseline ability too that just everyone had. And Amber's ability, quote unquote, was called diagnosis, where she could not only heal you, but she could understand also what was ailing you. So if you were sick, if you had an internal injury or an external injury, she would know. But she would have to, like, touch you and start healing you and stuff like that. So she was able to basically read your entire medical record right there and then. um that only had one payoff, which was Ethan showed up in the Mirage scene and he was hurt, and Amber wanted to heal him. And then while she was healing him, her diagnosis ability was like, sucking her deeper and deeper into his black hole of magic within him. And then, with Shadow, the abyss gazed back at her, and Shadow was like, "Get out." And then she was like, "Oh, wait, what? That's not normal." And so that's how they got onto the whole topic of conversation that Ethan was a fragment Shadow. It's so cheap and stupid, and I'm glad I got rid of all that. But her being able to make golden sparkles, that hasn't changed. That's always been part of her character. And it's more like a fun little tidbit to make her a little bit more special than just like, oh, she's timid and she goes around healing people. Like, she also makes sparkles. Yay! Dr. Amber. Well, Amber's always been a doctor. Come on, she's a healer. Well, and an intern right now, but she is a healer. So the original draft went all the way to the end. Yes, it was a full book, start to finish. And it was, I want to say, posted on my Wattpad at some point. Yes, I have a Wattpad account. No, don't come and sue me. I have my rights. Yeah, so it's a whole complete actual thing that you could have read at some point. How long was it? Let me look it up, because I still have it sitting around. I haven't gotten rid of it. Shadowbound, old. So, going off of the digital copy I have here, I have uh can I not see the word count in viewing mode? I guess I can't. That No, that's No, I didn't want to type. Oh jeez. I've forgotten my shortcuts. Word count. Control shift C. Bleh. Okay. So, Shadowbound, the published version, going off of the digital copy, is 319 pages, 90,697 words. And then the old Shadowbound, which, yeah, by the way, Echo also drew that cover as well. The old Shadowbound is only 122 pages with 62,645 words. So the published version is longer by about 30,000 words. But the old version is a complete draft, start to finish. And it's the same thing with It's the same thing with the second book too. Like I wrote a whole draft start to finish. There's no gaps or anything missing. Um like ages ago. And that's a complete draft. I believe I mentioned that yesterday. However, it follows the old draft of Shadowbound, which all of those mechanics are outdated. So once again, I am recycling a bunch of stuff uh, from the old draft of the second book to use in the new draft of the second book. But for the most part, a lot of the stuff is actually new because I have changed a whole lot about it, which I will speak more on when the book is actually published and I'm doing those readings. But for now, yeah, 2 of the 3 books actually have completed first drafts from beginning to end. It's the third book that I've been struggling to write for reasons. But I have a feeling that once I actually roll around to like properly sitting down and reading, or not reading, writing that book, it'll be a lot better because now I have a clearer idea of what I want things to be like. Because beforehand, there was so much that were in the books that I didn't necessarily like. Like the mechanics of how Ethan and Shadow worked. Like the auras, you know, some of the characters' personalities and dynamics. Um so while it was a good foundation, it was a very shaky foundation too. And yeah, that kind of manifested in the third draft as what the hell am I doing? So I didn't write a whole lot of the third book. That one does not have a completed draft at all. It has parts, it has scenes, but nothing from start to finish. The wand looks like a lollipop. The wand is based off of a wand that's in Gotcha Life, actually. That's why it looked so basic. And I still kind of use the basic frame rate, frame rate. Still basic framing for his current wand. It just doesn't look like that. It's a stick with a disc rather than like all the weird things around it. Yeah. Oh no. Trio abuse. Ugh. Yeah. Lucre used to get the short end of the stick a lot. I think that was all based off of the first draft. Because the first draft of Shadowbound, yeah, he was very much just kind of pulled around by everyone. He didn't really have as much of a say in what he got to do. And he was always butting heads with Ethan. Then again, I scrapped the love triangle. That was also in the old version of Shadowbound a little bit. It wasn't super strong, but it was there. It was being set up. Yes. Yes. And then, of course, in that version, Ethan won. But now there's no competition. Then again, I don't really want to make it about romance or anything. It's just some friends having fun. killing evil wishes and stuff, I guess. Oh, man. That is very old, Luke. Oh boy. See, what I do for character designs lately is because I can't draw. So, what I like to do is, I like to launch Gotcha. The current version of Gotcha is Gotcha Life 2, but on my computer I have Gotcha Club, which is the version before that. So I go into Gotcha Club and I make the character there, and then I show it to Echo, and I'm like, okay, Echo, here's kind of what I want. And then she sits me down and it's like, okay, well then we'll look through some things and make it fancy. Oh, and that's old Amber there. Hot pink hair. That's Ethan. Ethan hasn't changed a whole lot. Oh yeah, Jake used to have a shield too. It didn't do anything. It was just kind of like a gift from Kimberly. It was actually made of ice and painted red and gold. But he didn't really use it a whole lot, so it's just like I think I'm just gonna not give him the shield because that's a little bit too much. But otherwise, he hasn't changed much too. And that's old Kimberly. She looks like she's 5. I swear. They all look like either 5 or 3, not 16, 18, 20, well, however old. Yeah, so in actuality, they haven't changed much from how I made them in Gotcha. It's just they look a little more uh unique and befitting of the world that they live in because Gotcha is obviously very restricting. Hat. Yes, because you were being all iffy and stuff about the hat at some point. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna not send you a picture of the hat. I did want to get rid of his hat. Not in Shadowbound though. And the cape, well, okay. I was thinking cuz he only has the cape to protect himself against Shadow by proxy Riona, but mostly Shadow. So now that Riona's gone, he doesn't need the cape anymore. I mean, I figured he'd keep it around for a little bit longer because he's paranoid, but well, he good to know that he still has his cape and he still has his hat. That hasn't gone away anymore. That has changed. But he gets a new cape because his old cape got ruined. Hat's still the same though. Yeah, the cape that he has in Shadowbound is a really old cape. That's why it's so rugged, full of holes. Jake has no sword. Yeah, so Jake was a little bit more of like a knightly character back in the old draft and beyond. Again, sword and shield, but I got rid of the shield. It was a little bit too much. Yeah, spoilers. You're just gonna have to wait until the next book is published. I need to get back to doing that. Yeah, Lisa. Oh boy. Ah, yes, that's Hmm. Anything else I can comment on? Gotta go, but it was awesome hearing the ending of the book. Keep it up. Well, thank you for being here. Greatly appreciate it. Be sure to thank Echo on your way out if you haven't already. Anyone else with questions, comments, theories for the next book? Are you excited for the next book? Oh boy. Well, you don't count. Because if not, I think I will wrap up the reading here. This has been fun. This has been very fun. I don't need to talk about that. Please get that off the screen. They were your designs. I also don't want to talk about that. That is so wildly off topic. Anyway, I think that might be it. So, thank you all for being here live, if you were here live. If you are rewatching this in the future, hello, future. Thank you for being here and listening to my ramblings. I hope you enjoyed Shadowbound, and I hope you are excited for the sequel. If you have not yet bought a copy of Shadowbound yet, you can do so via the link in the description below or in the pinned chat message above. And thank you to Echo for drawing all these lovely pieces of art for all the readings. You have been wonderful. All right. Well, I hope you all have an amazing time zone and enjoy yourself. Goodbye.